And now we are starting the second panel of our conference. We will have 4 panelists, 2 from Hungary, 1 from Latvia, and 1 from Vilnius. It will about the situation of the churches in these countries. At first paper, it will be presented by Māra Kiope, who is from the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, University of Latvia, and the topic of the paper, it will be the decade of Vatican silence, Catholic Church in Latvia, 1946-1956. The floor is yours.
Dear colleagues, thank you very much, Professor Łatka, Polish friends, dear friends, colleagues. I would like to present this item and at the beginning, what is a silence from Vatican? In 1956, when Metropolitan of Riga, Archbishop Antoni Springovich, celebrated his 80th birthday, a congratulatory telegram arrived from the Vatican for the first time in the post-war years, in 1956, Vatican had broken the silence that had lasted the entire post-war period up to this moment, in fact, even 12 years. By this time, Latvia had already experienced the 3 occupations of the totalitarian regimes. The first Soviet occupation in 1940 and 41, the occupation of the German Nazi regime in 1941 and 1944, and now again the Soviet totalitarian regime. The hierarchy, clergy and believers of the Catholic Church of Latvia had no illusions about these regimes. And there I omit my text, simply comment. There is a simple resume that during the pre-war period in Latvia, Catholic Church, however, not dominating, its dominating was Lutheran Church. But anyway, it was vibrant, alive, and a very beautiful church. Everything was lost by occupation in 1940. Here we see the first experience of the Soviet totalitarian regime, which tried to annihilate the church. In June 17, 1941, Soviet tanks entered Riga after Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which divided Polish country and which fully gave to Stalin 3 Baltic states. And in 1941, deportations to Siberia took place, also where there were many Catholic people among the deported to Siberia. One of the first things was to cut off ties with Vatican, and the second was to annihilate the priests. And believing people were very negatively surprised about this experience. And the third thing was to annihilate identity, religious symbols. You can see here, it is statue of St. Virgin Mary in Ludza town. In one night in 1940, it was then broken and hands were cut off and the face was distorted. And this only 2 weeks ago, at least, on the fully restored statue, also the crown of the stars was put on. One of the cruelest cases was of priest Vladislaus Lithuaniaks from Vichy, Paris, when mass graves were opened after German invasion and the distorted bodies of Soviet regime victims had been allowed to recognize and bury. The priest's hands were handcuffed. He had barbed with wire crown on his head. and nails driven under his fingernails. On his chest and the back was cut sign of the cross. All the time of torturing, the priest was reciting the rosary and praying for the murderers. Finally, 2 nails were driven through his head, and the priest died. And he was not alone. Of these martyrs in 1940, in 41, the first Soviet occupation. In 1941, the second experience of totalitarian regime came. It is Nazi Germany regime. Simply accumulating, it could be said that the attitude of Catholics to Germans were very different, from cheering up as after terror of Bolsheviks until the resistance. What is stressed here, but there must be done research also on the very interesting book you published at your institute, we had in our bags, about rescue of Holocaust victims. And of course this was secretly done and this was hidden. We have no information, we have only some traces. But we know that Archbishop Metropolitan Antoni Springović was under Gestapo observance, and so the real operator was auxiliary bishop of Riga, Jāzeps Rančāns, who actually secretly ordered Latvian priests and Catholic people to help to rescue Jews. And we can mention there priest Alois Broks, we can see her among Catholic people before the war, the director of Aglona Catholic Gymnasium who was rescuing and also was dealing in homilies about you shall not kill. And he was arrested and he died in Stuttgart concentration camp. Above we see Kazimierz Vilnis, Latvian priest who served in Riga and served also to Jews, and it's in Stockholm. In exile he received this award from Israel State of Righteous Among Nations and with some of his rescues. But as I said, it must be researched. We know also that Marian monastery in Viljandi was bombed by Germans at the end of war because they were hiding Jews. It was revenge for that. But this must, at least in September 1944, 3 bishops were forcibly taken off from Latvia. Gestapo arrived in homes and take off Venerable Bishop Boleslav Sloskans. Here we see him above when he returning from Gulag camp, as he was exchanged by Latvia Republic to Russian spy, Soviet Russian spy before the war. And here we see him at the end of life in Belgium. Also, Bishop Antonis Urbs died in Monserrata Monastery in Spain, and mentioned bishops Jāzeps Rančāns. They were forcibly took away. Only Archbishop Metropolitan Antonis Springović hidden and left in Latvia, as he pretended to be very, very sick when Gestapo arrived. And some words about that Archbishop Metropolitan Antonis Springović absolutely clearly stated in secret report to Vatican that the German Nazis want the same as Soviets did, to annihilate the church, to use the church material property for their war needs, and to very tightly to control the priests and to beat down them who were opposite. There were no illusions for Latvian Church, also about German Nazis, like about Soviet regime. Some words, it's another line, I will not discuss it here, that in exile it was, how to say, God's providence. They were forcibly took away to Germany, but after the war they become very well very well-known leaders of Latvian Catholics, of Latvian exile, political exile as such, which played very important role in, if to say, in Cold War politics and in making attitude of the Western countries to the occupation of Baltic states. Like it was known very well that Baltic immigrants, Baltic political exiles were unproportionately active in comparison with their number. I remember Australians said that in Australian elections they were also looking, what would say about these candidates, Baltic people from Latvia, Lithuania? There's so many. No, they're not so many, but they're very active and very lousy. Yes, and Jāzeps Rančāns was the Speaker of Sejm, of Parliament, and until his death in Grand Rapids, United States, he was executive of Latvia president. He was Latvia president in exile and was symbolizing this country we have lost, but we wanted again to restore. And Borislavs Sloskāns, as you know, was in Belarus. He was Mohilev Minsk administrator, and he stays to be until the end. He prayed and made sacrifices about his people in Belarus, and also was patronage on Belarusian and Russian migrants, Catholics in Europe. And besides, Bishop Jāzeps Rančāns was member of Latvia Council who tried to make resistance against Soviets at the end of the war. But Germans were discovering them, their intentions to restore the independent state, and annihilated these people, many of these people. Also, this council of Latvia Council Central organized this crossing the Baltic Sea. When front was coming, nobody has illusions what could be expected from the Soviets, and very many people left Latvia in very late autumn by boat, crossing the Baltic Sea to Sweden, with hopes that they would return very soon. It's 50 years. And we see this photo from such people who are leaving Latvia coast in fishing boats to cross the sea to save them. In emigration became as many from Latgale part, the eastern part of Latvia, which is dominantly Catholic, were migrating to Baltic Sea coast and stayed there. And so only after restoration of independence in 1991, Archbishop Cardinal Jānis Pujāts initiated building of new churches, approximately 20 churches in the previously non-Catholic regions where these peoples and their child were living. Also forced migration, we could call forced immigration, it's deportations. You can see number of priests and those in exiles and those in Gulag camps. And what happened now? Exactly, the war is over. Anticipating the possibility that Latvia could once again fall again under communist totalitarianism, in 1944, the Vatican had given secret instructions for the actions of the church hierarchy, giving all directionary powers to the local ordinaries if communication was not possible. The activity of the church was affected by this forced migration, as I mentioned it. But anyway, in 1947, 2 new bishops were elected. Actually, one Polish professor of Latvia University who left from Latvia to Poland in 1945 was taking with him a secret message to Vatican, and somehow, in a very secret way, the answer were going back and was received in Latvia that Strots and Dulbinskis as a candidates are approved. So in 1947, they both were ordained as bishops. And the object of Soviet regime was elimination of religion and its replacement with universal atheism. Clearly realizing this, the Church has worked in various directions, which were connected with the permanent task of pastoral care. As our colleagues from Poland mentioned, the main accent was on pastoral care. This was the main field of battle between the Church and the atheistic state, as it was the fight for the souls. If atheistic propaganda has ridiculed fishing for souls, the Church searched for the souls to save them. Thus, one of the first acts of loyalty demonstration of loyalty, even in 1945, was when Archbishop Antoni Springović ordered Latvia churches to pray, to give thanksgiving masses for liberation from Nazis, and also to collect donations for the Red Army soldiers' hospital. National independence fighters of Forest Brothers have stayed in the woods with guns in hand to resist the Soviet regime until they hoped the American and British armies would enter Latvia to restore the independence. Lithuanians. On March 20, 1945, the Archbishop Springović issued an order for priests in every possible appropriate case, like funerals, visiting the sick, speak with people so they would convince those in forest to return home. His Excellency ought to do this, as Soviet authorities demanded it as the obligatory prerequisite in talking about the opening of the Riga Major Seminary. Remarkably, in the document, Archbishop Springović calls them deserteers from German army, not bandits, like Soviets. To the end, this document was supplied by the remarks that it does not need to be announced yet. What does it mean? Asked Soviet authorities. To the rebuke, the Archbishop answered, "We are in charge about people's lives, so you must give guarantees that those who are going out of the forest would not be repressed. Until this time, this my how to say claim is not announced in churches, and so you see this double game, this who makes who. Many Catholic priests and believers secretly supported the Forest Brothers, while some priests were openly involved in the struggle of armed resistance, together with Forest Brothers. But this did not contribute to the security of the Church. In the very difficult historical situation, spiritual solutions and pastoral care come to the fore, which allows for finding a way in the complex labyrinth of relations with totalitarian power, in situation when Vatican silences.
You have 5 minutes more.
Ah, okay. Really?
Yeah. Only 5.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. Then, once again, the first thing the Soviets want to do was to cut ties with Vatican. Even was their fantastic proposal that there could be the Catholic Church of Soviet Union, and the head of it in Moscow could be Riga Archbishop Antoni Springović, but he refused this. The second was so-called declericalization, which meant simply annihilation of the priests. But here we must go also to mystical dimension, as priests in these gulag camps also were providing pastoral works. They were celebrating Holy Mass in cans on their chests in barracks. and somewhere in where cows were staying and so on. And ratherly this secret hidden sacrifices, I suppose, promoted the restoration of Latvia's state. Here is Jānis Mendriks, Marian Fazek, who was praying absolution in Vorkut Lag and was shot together with peoples imprisoned here. And here we see Aglona Church in 1950s and Sister Tegla, who was expelled from school because she openly said she wanted to be a member of order of Poor Child Jesus. These are very, very happy Soviet people in Soviet Latvia. And okay, but the conclusion is, I must avoid this, the conclusion is that this sacred mystical dimension plays more important role. The main was the Good Shepherd. Good Shepherd, the priest as Good Shepherd, who was going with motorcycle on different roads, on terrible roads, in terrible weather, who were catechizing kids in spite of to be forbidden, and who fights with these Soviet authorities to build up, to restore the churches. And at least this major seminar question, colleagues from Croatia mentioned it, and from Serbia also, that there were an attempt to create special trustworthy for Soviets circles of pastors and priests. This was an attempt in Latvia too, but the very great block among this was the Riga Major Seminary, where people were united around Bishop Pēteris Strots as its rector, and this was network of trustfully priests aroused who were possible to make common tactics against Soviets. And also they had finances uncontrolled for Soviets and helped many little congregations to survive, to get out from extraordinary taxes. And to save the seminary. Also Bishop Strots in 1952 participated in the peace conference in Moscow. He was called, oh, it is red bishop. Oh, bishop is making us communists. But actually he paid, these were great praise, the hierarchy paid to save Catholic Church in Latvia, major seminar, believers. This modus vivendi about which Bishop Urbs wrote to Sloskans and Ransats, I don't know how they are managing things with communists. I don't understand anything in this modus vivendi. But let them do, maybe they see better on the places. Yes, and that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. And now the second panelist, it will be Gergely Iso, who is from our friendly institution, Office of the Committee of National Remembrance from Hungary. And his topic, it will be resistance and collaboration in the Evangelical-Lutheran Church in Hungary in the Rákosi-era. Please, Gergely.
Thank you so much, dear colleagues. In Hungary, the situation is quite the opposite than in Latvia, since the Hungarian Lutherans belong to the smallest church among the three historical denominations, the Roman Catholic, the Reformed, and the Lutheran Church. And the situation was not different between the period of our current observation. According to the 1949 census, only 480,000 people avowed themselves to be Lutherans out of the 9.2 million souls in Hungary. In the peace treaty of Trianon, which concluded the First World War between Hungary and the winner states, Hungary lost 2/3 of her territory, and this territorial loss affected the Lutheran Church the most sensitively out of the other Christian denominations, since a very considerable ratio, more than 60% of the Lutherans lived in the disannexed areas. In spite of her losses, the Lutheran Church developed a well-organized institutional system. She ran high-quality schools where later world-famous scientists and scholars completed their secondary schooling. The Church developed a very flourishing inner missionary work, which resulted in a constant growing tendency regarding the number of Lutheran believers until the outbreak of the Second World War. Concerning foreign relations, the Church tried to break out of the isolation evolved after the First World War and started to establish closer relations with Scandinavian states, especially Sweden and Finland. In the meantime, the leaders of the Church devoted great care to take part in the most important international and even ecumenical interchurch movements, which were very popular in post-war Europe and in the US, and which resulted in the foundation of several international church organizations, such as the Lutheran World Convent, later renamed as Lutheran World Federation, or the World Council of Churches. And finally, despite her small size, the ratio of the intelligentsia was surprisingly overrepresented compared to that of the other churches. Therefore, the political system after World War II, controlled more and more by the communists, regarded not only the larger and hence more prestigious churches, that is the Roman Catholic and the Reformed churches, as enemies, but the Lutherans as well. After the catastrophe of World War II, the traditional social hierarchy system in Hungary collapsed. The former leading social stratum, the gentry, completely disappeared. Meanwhile, the largest class, the peasantry, gained political rights. In this reforming society, Christian churches represented the most significant organic power in organizing and having effect on the entire Hungarian society. No wonder why the communists considered them as a real concurrency and a great danger to their power. The first successful offensive on governmental level against churches was launched in 1948. There had been local atrocides beforehand, though, since 1945. I would only like to highlight here one of them because of its shocking brutality. It was very similar, we heard of in the previous presentation. The Lutheran pastor of the settlement Péteri, called Gyula Csaba, was kidnapped by local communists of the neighboring village, was cruelly tortured, mutilated. For example, they ripped off his male organs too, and finally crucified him. So in 1948, the first successful governmental offensive against churches started. The communists decided to nationalize the whole educational system. By then, most schools had been in church property. Now the state wanted to take them into public ownership. Moreover, they expected the churches to hand them over voluntarily. In the Lutheran Church, only one of the four bishops, Lajos Ordas, bishop of the Mountain Diocese, along with the lay leader of the church, Inspector Albert Radwanski, stood up against this attempt and tried everything to preserve the schools in church property. They resisted the statal will, not just because they were convinced that schools meant the future Lutheran recruitment, but also because of the students, parents, and teachers of Lutheran schools expected this kind of attitude from the church leaders. Despite the resistance, schools were nationalized anyway. The negotiations and debates with the church about schools proved to be very useful for the communists. They could assess who were those church leaders who were impossible to be made collaborate. This resulted in the arresting of Bishop Lajos Ordas and Inspector Albert Radvánszky and another Lutheran pastor, Sándor Varga, and the end of August 1948. They were prosecuted based on malicious charges, false charges, concretely financial machinations. The whole investigation and judicial trial were performed in hardly more than 1 month. In the end, Varga was sentenced 3 years, Ordas was sentenced 2 years in prison on the 1st of October, and the proceeding against Radvánszky was seized because of his health condition and his resignation from his church position. After getting rid of the most resisting leaders, there were no obstacle in the way to make the Lutheran Church sign a so-called agreement with the state. The government referring to the principle of the separation of state and church and to the peaceful coexistence made all religious denominations sign an agreement. In theory, this document was to ensure the free existence of churches within the socialist state, but in fact it submitted churches to the state. The church had to recognize the Hungarian then Republic, later People's Republic. In return, the state subsidized the church in a gradually decreasing measure and gave back 2 secondary schools out of those having been nationalized. The new collaborating church leaders, however, offered even these 2 schools to the state in 1952. Therefore, until the political changes in 1989, there was no Lutheran education in Hungary. Speaking of the change in church leadership, as the end of Ordas's prison sentence was getting nearer, it became more and more urgent to deprive him of his bishopric. It would have been unacceptable if Ordas had been reinstated in his office after his release. So the new inspector of the church, called Ivan Rök, who had also been a politician and a member of parliament until 1949, following the central will, initiated to set up a disciplinary council which would remove the bishop from his office. Although the council was set up, most of its members were not volunteers. They were threatened if they hadn't participated in the procedure or had voted for Ordas's stay. Ordas would be charged of being a treasonous spy, which would end in a death penalty. In order to emphasize the threat, 2 of Ordas's closest colleagues were also arrested and tortured in the headquarters of the state security and thereafter interned. Under these circumstances, Ordas was removed from his office in the spring 1950, but only with 4 votes out of the 12 members of the disciplinary council. All the others gave an invalid vote. Not much later, still in 1950, for the pressure of the state, a new bishop was put into Ordas's stead, whose name was László Dezséry, and the lay leadership of the diocese was handed to a communist and declared atheist politician, József Darvas, who was, by the way, a well-known novelist too. While in 1948 the government was satisfied with getting rid of only those church leaders who resisted the state, in the 1950s those whom they found not cooperative and collaborative enough were also removed from their position. The motto was that those who are not with us are against us. As I have already mentioned, there used to be 4 bishops who headed the 4 historical dioceses of the Hungarian Lutheran Church. After Ordas was replaced by László Dezséry, 2 of the bishops, Dezséry himself and the head of the Tisza diocese, Lajos Vető, were already the servants of the state. Lajos Vető became bishop at the end of 1948 on strong state pressure. The other 2 bishops were not resistors like Ordas, but would cooperate with the state only until a limit. In 1952, a synod was summoned, which was made reorganize the church governmental system. The historical dioceses were abolished, and 2 new ones were founded in their stead, the northern and the southern diocese. And the two remaining non-collaborator bishops were forced to resign, so László Dezséry and Lajos Vető could automatically take their seats in the new bishoprics. The above-mentioned church inspector, Ivan Rök, who had instituted the disciplinary process against Ordas, also had to resign, and he fell out of grace with the political power. He was replaced by a politician of high rank called Ernő Mihályfi, who had controlled the personal changes in the church since 1948. Of course, the new and in quotation marks democratic era didn't have effects only on the leadership of the church. Between 1948 and 1951, all civil, non-governmental organizations were wound up, and foundations, associations, federations, societies, etc., with Lutheran background could not avoid this fate either. Civil life between the two world wars and right after the second was very flourishing. There were several different organizations for different parts of religious life or for different types of religious people. There were societies gathering the Lutheran youth, helping to give religious answers to the questions and problems of their age. There were women's associations, cultural organizations like the Luther Federation. There were associations for pastors, pastors' wives, for students, etc. Finally, there were many pious foundations to give financial support and aid or scholarship for important church purposes. They were all, in more ways, dissolved, and their properties and fortune were, in many cases, nationalized. In this way, religious activity and life were squeezed inside the walls of the church. This became especially true when in 1949 the state, breaking their own promise, made religious education in the by then national schools facultative. From then on, the parents who would have their children enrolled in religious class had to face humiliation, harassment, or even persecution. There was a huge change regarding foreign affairs too. First of all, keeping in touch with Western European relations became almost impossible. Getting a passport to a country outside the Iron Curtain was only possible for few. Meanwhile, visits from outside were also quite restricted. This also made it impossible for students of the Lutheran theology to take a Western scholarship, which used to be a very common practice among the to-be pastors. Relations between such international organizations and as the Lutheran World Federation or the World Council of Churches became also very tense since Ordas's imprisonment. Ordas had been the vice president of the Lutheran World Federation since 1947. That is why World Lutheranism paid a very close attention to his fate. Until his case wasn't solved and he wasn't rehabilitated, the leaders of the Lutheran World Federation wouldn't cooperate with the new church leadership. They were very distrustful to them. In 1951, state control was placed on a higher level. This year, the State Office for Church Affairs was set up and was directly supervised by the Council of Ministers. Its duty was to execute the strategy of the Communist Party regarding churches. This meant that from then on, there could be no church meetings without a member of the office sitting there. They could give orders to church leaders or even pastors. They censored the sermon of the pastors who would preach in the religious half hour on the radio, and they gave instructions what kind of articles should appear in the newspapers. All in all, the State Office for Church Affairs maintained full power over each church and religious group, the Lutherans included. Of course, these aggressive changes did not always meet acquiescence on the part of Lutheran pastors. In the case of Ordas's removal from his bishopric or of other illegitimate measures, that is making Lajos Vető or László Dezséry bishop, etc., pastors often opposed or collected petitions for reinstating legality. In most cases, they were not punished by state authorities, but by the collaborative church leadership. The most common ways of punishment were either suspension and dismissal, or transferring to a congregation of a faraway village in the countryside. In 1956, even before the outbreak of the Hungarian Revolution, radical changes began in the Evangelical-Lutheran Church in Hungary. After the famous 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, a wave of rehabilitation started in Hungary too, which also affected the Lutheran denomination. The direct cause that evoked the changes in the church was the conference of the World Council of Churches that was held in the summer of 1956 in Hungary. The Reformed Church in Hungary, which was also a member of the WCC, had a better reputation than the Lutheran leaders, had managed to successfully invite the council to Hungary. It was clear that Western church leaders coming to the program would come up with the question of Ordas. Therefore, the State Office for Church Affairs brought up the Ordas case, re-examined it, and not only did they realize that he had been convicted unjustly, but also realized the importance of his very branching out foreign relations that would fit in the new political concept of infiltrating into international organizations, religious ones involved. When the Western Church leaders arrived and did come up with the Ordas question, the state had already decided to rehabilitate him and sometime later to reinstate him as a bishop. So they could easily promise this to the foreigners who left Hungary satisfied. At the beginning of October, Ordas was rehabilitated indeed. And in the days of the Hungarian Revolution and freedom fight, Ordas could return as the head of the Lutheran Church. Meanwhile, all earlier collaborating church leaders resigned. Since the communist state wanted him back as a bishop, he could remain in his position after the revolution was crushed for more than 1.5 years. But since Ordas didn't fulfill the hopes of the state and he wouldn't become a collaborator himself, he was removed from his office once again in June 1958 and was forced into retirement. To sum it up, it could be seen that the political power tried to break the social significance of the church or churches by all means. And from a historical point of view, we can't say they were unsuccessful. The terror of the 1940s and 50s was only the first phase in this process. This period broke and discredited the church leadership. The second phase, the Kádár-era after the 1956 revolution, with its softer and more tolerant dictatorship, broke most of the pastors and the mass of believers. What could prove this more authentically than the first census of the post-communist era, which measured that the number of Lutherans was almost halved in the past 50 years. Nowadays, we are only about 150, 200,000. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gergely. And now we have a paper who is also presented by the panelists from Hungary. It will be a paper of Réka Kiss, the chairperson of the Committee of National Remembrance, and the title of this paper, it will be The Situation and Strategy of the Protestant Church in Hungary in the 1950s. One moment.
So now we woke up everybody, so I can continue my paper and continue the what my colleague Gergely said about the Hungarian Protestantism, the Hungarian Lutheran churches. In my lecture, I would like to examine how the communist church policy toward the Protestant denominations, in particular the Calvinist church, developed during the years of Sovietization and the period of Stalinism. in Hungary. And looking at the issue in a broader context, I would like to compare the similarities and differences, at least in some respect, in the policies and tactics used by the communist parties against both the largest and the second largest Christian denomination in Hungary, that is the Roman Catholic Church and the Calvinist Church, respectively. For the sake of the better understanding of the whole processes, first I would like to place the situation in the Hungarian Protestantism in a broader historical context, that I would like to outline the main features of the communist policy pursued toward the Calvinist Church. And finally, I would like to highlight some of the sometimes very long-lasting consequences of this policy. So, firstly, unfortunately it's in Hungarian, but you can find out the most important information. So, the historical context. So, in Hungary, whether we consider the Austro-Hungarian monarchy or the post-Trianon Hungary, Hungary was one of the most religiously complex states in modern Europe, and it retained the distinctive characteristics of this denominational diversity until the end of the Second World War. Various forms of religious socialization played a significant role in shaping culture and political mentality and attitudes of the different strata of society. In addition, for complex historical reasons, the different denominations basically regarded each other as rivals. This was definitely true of the relationship between the Catholic Church, representing the largest community, and the second most populous, namely the Reformed Protestant or Calvinist denominations. Although the political establishment between the two world wars, the so-called Horthy-era, which defined itself as a Christian course, tried to ease tensions between the churches, this proved to be only partially successful. The Reformed community criticized the quasi-state church status of the Catholic Church, the economic and property-related advantages that were inherited from history from the Counter-Reformation era. By contrast, the Catholics saw a permanent source of danger, primarily in the over-representation of the Calvinist Church in the public, cultural, especially in the political elite, which was far exceeded their numbers. Just one example, István Bethlen, who served as prime minister from 1925 to 1931, and the governor, Miklós Horthy, himself were both members of the Reformed Church or Calvinist Church in Hungary. I have only mentioned all this to give you a better understanding of one of the basic tactics of the Hungarian Communist Party in church policies from the very beginning, which was accurately recognize the very real dividing lines of Hungarian society and consciously seek to deepen the rifts, to turn the different social groups, including the different denominations, against each other, and to apply the principle of divide et impera, divide and rule. So divide and rule, divide et impera at several levels. And I would like to illustrate this with a quite relatively lengthy quote. I think the time has come to take action against the clerical reaction. Another point is that not all churches should be treated in the same way, on the same basis, under the same circumstances. We remember that when the situation with the churches escalated in 1947-48, we made a distinction and did not act with the same means with all of them. First, we tried to reach an agreement with one of them and then use this agreement against, not pro, but against the other. The same method should be followed now. The Catholic Church has long been the most decisive, strongest nest of clerical reaction in Hungary, so this is what we must fight against in the first place, and with the other churches we must try to agree on the old foundations and use them against the Catholic Church. There are suggestions here that arrests should be made. This is what I suggest. But it's worth considering whether, for example, we should arrest priests from Calvinist Church. Let's start with the Catholics, and then the Reformed Church will learn from them, and they will know what to do. The quotation dates from 1957, the initial period of reprisal after the suppressing of the revolution of 1956. The speaker is Gyula Kálai, the ideological secretary of the Communist Party and the Ministry of the Cultural Affairs in the government of János Kádár. And I brought this quote here for two reasons. First, Kálai's words clearly show that although the Kádár government tried to maintain its distance from the Stalinist Rákosi-era in the public communication, it did, in fact, borrow from the toolbox of Mátyás Rákosi. So behind the level of propaganda, there is a real continuity, especially in the field of church politics. And the second, this quotation enlightens some of the most important elements of the communist toolbars. What was this toolbox? Firstly, it encouraged division and confrontation between the churches, and secondly, it employed a means of political stigmatization. The Catholic Church was identified with clerical reaction, and this foreshowed the Protestant Churches being assigned the role of an exemplary, cooperating, progressive church that from 1945 onwards, the Communist Party formulated a well-elaborated strategy and role allocation for Protestants. But this took time, partly because the openly anti-clerical and anti-religious policies of the Communist Party caused the old anti-communist leaders of each churches to set aside their differences and cooperate with one another. It's very interesting how the overtly anti-Protestant Cardinal Mindszenty, who was very anti-communist as well, trying to open up to other denominations on the common basis of anti-communism. And the communists had difficulties on the other hand, because, as you may know, after 1945, the full communist takeover in Hungary did not take place immediately. Even though the country was under Soviet occupation, the anti-communist smallholder party won 57% majority in parliamentary election with strong Calvinist representation in its leadership. It was only at the turn of 47-48, after the elimination of its political opponents, that the Hungarian Communist Party had seized enough power to systematically eliminate the remnants of social, economic, and cultural pluralism. The final phase of this process was to declare an open attack on the churches, especially on the Catholic Church and personally Cardinal Mindszenty. And this attack, it was introduced by an intensive and coordinated anti-Catholic propaganda campaign in which the Communist Party systematically constructed a new master narrative and a new image of enemy. Thanks to its carefully devised language policy offensive, they managed to introduce a new concept of clerical reactionarism, I think it's a concept familiar to you, into the public discourse, in a manner that rendered this term highly fluid and undefinable. And it's, I think, very, very important. Then they waved a web of negative connotations to clerical reactionarism that carried the accusation of being anti-progressive, anti-democratic, and finally anti-pro-fascist. And they use this as a sort of synonyms. So a new powerful linguistic stigma has been introduced in that time to the public discourse. And in this big play, according to the intention of the Communist Party, only a supporting role was assigned to the Protestant Church leaders, namely that they had to represent the antithesis of this image. However, the democratically elected Protestant bishops refused to collaborate. So first of all, the communists had to find the most suitable new protagonists who were willing to demonstrate partly that it was possible to cooperate with the Communist Party, and on the second, and partly that the party was willing to cooperate with the churches, provided that they support progressive democratic political forces, which was equal to supporting the communist transformation. Given that the Calvinist and Lutheran churches are organized on a national basis and hold elective positions of church leadership, there were no external factors, such as the Vatican, to reckon with. This made the position of the Communist Party considerably easier. The toolbox of the party for implementing appropriate personal changes was very diverse, including such resignation forced by blackmail, intervention of the political police, crude electoral fraud, or even as seen in the case of Bishop Ordas show trial. All this represented a complete subversion of the autonomy of the churches. And this is the bird's-eye view. However, if we look one level deeper and examine the internal situation of Protestant churches, we can see a rather complex situation. As the Communist Party not only tried to exploit the principle of divide et impera between the denominations, but also carefully mapped the political and social fault line within the various churches. The composition of these churches was far more homogeneous. Political fault lines, their relationship to the past, their relationship to the Communist Party, different social background, as well as the existing social tensions within the churches, generational tensions, conflict within the church hierarchies. So there were a lot of differences that made the internal structure of democratically organized churches highly stratified and fragile. Therefore, the Communist Party, taking advantage of the existing international division, and easily found the appropriate persons that could use from a dynamic critical generation of young pastors who were critical of the past, had a radical social sensitivity, therefore have an openness towards the left-wing political ideas, and were either politically naive or career-minded, or could have been blackmailed, but for whatever reason were ready to cooperate. And there is one more very important thing, in addition, that these circles received support from unexpected sources. The story of this runs as follows. The most prestigious bishop of the Protestant community was László Ravas. He was elected in 1921. So he had been the leader of the Hungarian Protestant world for more than 3 decades. He was venerated as one of the greatest ecclesiastical and intellectual authorities of his time, far beyond the denominational boundaries. He was an active shaper of public life between the 2 world wars, and he was a bishop with openness to social reforms, but at the same time a kind of reform-minded conservative. I think it's a typical career in the 2 world war Central European life. But on the other hand, as a member of the upper house of the parliament, he not only voted together with all other church leaders for the anti-Semitic laws, but also spoke out in parliament in support of the first Jewish law. However, after the mass deportations began, Bishop Ravas used all his influence and authority and was the most outspoken of the church leaders against the persecution of the Jews, to the extent that he was compelled to go into hiding following the pro-Nazi Rákosi coup in 1944. So in many ways, it is an ambiguous but very typical Central European life career. Although after the war he was exempted from the verification process, the Communist Party took advantage of its public career without any hope of conducting real debates. Through the person of Ravas, therefore, it was easy to keep under pressure the public opinion of the Calvinist Church with a well-conceived press attack. He was well aware of it, and finally he resigned. As he wrote in his memoirs, "I was wise rather than brave." The church opposition to him developed around the popular Budapest pastor Albert Berecki. Berecki himself used to belong to Bishop Ravas' inner circle in the two world wars, between the two world wars. He was a charismatic preacher, and he belonged to the resistance movement during the German occupation, so he was had much clearer public career. He also played an active role in the public life in the Smallholders Party after 1945, but on rather a leftish basis. His ambitions as a clerical leader became increasingly evident, and he himself believed and asserted that it was possible to cooperate with the Communist Party, so it was quite understandable that he became Mátyás Rákosi's candidate. And now, the unexpected support. Berecki's campaign was personally championed by one of the most, if not the most influential figures in Western Protestant theology, namely the renowned Swiss Reformed theologian Karl Barth, the emblematic figure of the anti-Nazi German Confession Church, one of the authors of the famous Barmen Declaration against the pro-Nazi German Church. So he had an enormous authority after the Second World War, and like very many Western intellectuals, he turned to the political left after the war. Now you can understand the significance of the fact that Professor Barth personally visited Hungary in 1948. He published an open letter in which he praised Berecki's nomination as a bishop, praised his courage to confront the church past. So he legitimized Berecki's attitude of seeking opportunities to cooperate with the communist authorities. And this stance was made all of more stressed by Barth's reputation stemming from his past of opposing Nazis. But unfortunately, he did not realize, or did not want to realize, that he was urging a change of church policy that would lead the church survival strategy towards avoiding confrontation with the dictatorial regime at all costs, and thus falling into submission. He didn't recognize that he was promoting the very attitude that was rejected by his famous Barmen Declaration that opposed Hitlerism. And as times goes on, I would left my other interesting person, János Péter, and jump to my conclusions. So by 1949, individuals who were considered compatible with communist church policy occupied the highest positions among the Protestant clergy. But what did it mean for the daily life of the Protestant churches? And at the end of my paper, I would like to mention only a few points briefly. First of all, as a result, the discourse of church theological and organizational issues were all placed in a political context, had all become repoliticized, and thus became the service of the communist authorities. Moreover, the new church leadership started to theologically justify the policy of the Communist Party. A complete theological doctrine justifying the socialist system had been developed, known as the theology of servant church or the narrow way theology. Secondly, this required the development of a new theological language, which had two main features. On the one hand, they attempted to theologically underpin current political goals in a religious language, and on the other hand, they attempted to introduce communist political concepts into the public discourse of the churches, for example, the clerical reaction or class enemy, and so on. The third point, the Communist Party imposed on the churches coercive agreements that did not serve the interest of the church community, severely limited the autonomy of the church. Gergely spoke about it, and made the churches financially completely reliant on the party state. However, these agreements were celebrated by the new church leadership as the fruit of cooperation and as the measure of separation between church and state, although it was not true. The fourth point. Although the repressive machinery was established in the same way around the Protestant churches as around the Catholics, but there was a fundamental difference. In the case of Protestants, the suppression of church life, the suppression of potential opposition, the elimination of charismatic leaders, and the prevention of autonomous religious activity were primarily assigned to the church leadership. The principle of making the church unworkable by the church was applied. That's by implementing the concept of divide and rule within the church. This created a climate of fear and mistrust, not only between the party state and the church, but also within the church itself. It also turned the leadership of the church against the local congregations and the numerous pastors who were trying to live by their faith in new, creative, hidden forms of their daily lives. And this is my 5 points. Fifth point, that many tacit forms of church resistance emerged at congregational level. For example, concealing the activities of dissolved church association, but covertly continuing them within the legal congregational frameworks and so on. My 6th point, the new church leadership was not homogeneous either. Albert Berecki saw himself as lesser evil, the bishop who served the survival of the church as best as he could, as opposed to the much more hardliner Stalinist János Péter. And this presents us with a genuine dilemma. Thanks to the church policy which subordinated the official structure of the Calvinist Church and its theological doctrine to the communist regime, the primary physical atrocities was considerably less commonplace than in the case of the Catholic Church. In the case of the Protestant, there were no campaign-style mass arrests and show trials. Fewer people were jailed. There were arrests, people were killed, but not as many as in the Catholic cases. Protestant pastors with families, and it's very important, with families, could be broken and intimidated through their families in many other ways. The most common form was the forced replacement or making them financially insecure. There are numerous examples of this, such as placing pastors with young children in small villages without public transport, schools, or doctors, or withdrawing their state salary supplement, the so-called congrua, from pastors with large families, which literally resulted in physical poverty and existential tragedies. So the dictatorship was essentially incorporated into the internal operations of church itself. In the Hungarian Catholic Church, this process began only in the 1960s in a very different political context. But the other hand of this dilemma, however, is that in many cases it was these drastic ecclesiastical measures that ensured the physical survival of the priests concerned. And finally, the last area of church policy to which I would like to mention only is the political role of church diplomacy in international church organizations, in particular in ecumenical bodies such as the World Council of Churches. This was a privileged era of soft power in the Cold War period, in which contact between East and West could be somehow legally maintained. The Hungarian party leadership, supposedly following Soviet instructions, was quick to recognize the potential of the ecumenical role of the Protestant church leaders, especially before 1961, when the Russian Orthodox Church joined the WCC. This, however, is a little research, but all the more exciting chapter of the religious Cold War, a complex issue with much potential in the field of such an international cooperation as ours. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Réka, for this very wide and interesting presentation. And now we are going to the last panelist of this panel, and it will be Kristina Burinskaitė from the Genocide and Resistance Research Center of Lithuania in Vilnius, and the topic it will be KGB agent activity against Lithuanian Catholic Church, the case studies.
Hello. I have to confess, I'm not a specialist of Catholic Church history. I'm a specialist of KGB activity. But former KGB archive is so full of information about Catholic Church. So after researching KGB in 20 years, so I became some sort of expert of Catholic Church in some perspective. That is why my presentation is a little bit about the history of Catholic Church and a little bit of KGB activity in this sphere. Catholic Church as an institution and priesthood was a society group that made most trouble for Soviet during all the occupation period. The struggle continued through all the Soviet period. Soviet used various methods against them. In the summer of 1940, Church has lost not only the state support it was receiving, but also was almost completely pushed out of public life. Almost all the real estate of Church was nationalized. Vatican was treated as anti-Soviet power, so Soviets wanted to cut off or control all the relationship of Lithuanian Church with outside world, especially Vatican. All priests, from the point of view Soviet authorities, were a priori dangerous political enemies, making a bad impact on the population. Until 6 June in 1941, 47 priests and monks were detained for some time. 35 were deported from Lithuania during the first mass deportation in 1941. 17 were killed as political prisoners during the retreat of Soviet army. In 1944-47 period, the regime did not try to impose too hard the model of Soviet religious cult, hoping to use its authority to suppress armed resistance. However, the ordinaries, on the priest, on the ground of principle of the Church non-interference into politics, refused to support one of the fighting sides. Not only support regime, but also they resist to support partisans also. We have to bear in mind, not everybody, priests and bishops, but some of them. Moreover, some of them actively protested against the restrictions of religious freedom and the government attempts to interfere in the internal life of the Church. For this reason, in 1946-47, most of the bishops were ruthlessly repressed. All of them refused to collaborate with MGB. One of the bishops, Vincentas Borisevičius, was sentenced to death. He was shot. Others were sentenced and sent to imprisonment in labor camps. Some of them died in the prisons because of very bad conditions and in uncertain circumstances. We have a doubt about their death. Two waves in this period we saw against priests. From 1944 to 1950. 391 priests were detained, put in prison in this period. After Stalin's time, Soviets gave up such brutal methods. Repressions were changed by more subtle measures. Except for the beginning of 7th decade, we call this period of Khrushchev. Brutal method against the Catholic Church when the churches were closed, destructed, or the monuments, but this long just for a short time. So later, atheistic propaganda, control of pastoral activity, more attention is paid to control of priesthood, bishop appointment, control of seminary. Relationship with Western countries also influenced the situation of church. When Soviet wanted to insinuate to the West to show how good life is in Lithuania, they lessened these brutal methods. But when they didn't want to show anymore nothing to West, they pushed up Catholic Church again. So Soviet government, depending on inner and international situation, its targets and purpose, changed its position toward church. However, it was treated as enemy all the time. They wanted to use church into implementing its targets, and who resisted were persecuted. Deportation, imprisonments, killings, discreditations, actions were used. To sum up, Soviet and Catholic Church had to maneuver, adjust to existing of each other. Agent was the main instrument KGB used against Church, and also agents were a tool to implement its task. Already in 1944, KGB released a directive saying, dealing with leaders with Catholic Church with the aim of bringing them under our influence. I want to press, dealing with the head of Catholic Church. In 1945 and 46, attempts were made to recruit all the bishops remaining in Lithuania as agents. We saw what happened, who refused. All they were repressed. KGB and the agent network in Catholic Church had to deal with such issues. KGB wanted to watch, control, and influence church as an institution through agents among seminaries, priests, bishops, governors. Also to control this group, discredit resistant priests, and in its way to reduce support to them in society. That is why KGB started from governors of church. KGB wanted very much for agents among bishops who had authority in society and Vatican to cooperate with them and implement their task. Such priests had to help the Soviet to fight with resistant priests, control appointment of various level priests, and activity of seminary to do influence in Vatican. Hierarchy of church were more restricted because they had to deal with Soviet institutions. That is why they were more vulnerable to pressure of KGB than ordinary priests. That is why more bishops, hierarchy leaders of Catholic Church were recruited. From 1950s, most of Catholic Church in Lithuania were run by men controlled by the Soviet security services. In early 1984, in the report of Lithuanian MGB, it is stated that they have 142 agents keeping a watch on Catholic priests. Of these, 57 were priests themselves. In 1956, were 60 recruited priests, out of total of number 900 working in Lithuania priests. Comparable figures for other denominations were 4 agents out of 22 Lutheran clergy and 4 out of 52 Orthodox. In 1970, there were over 100 recruited Catholic priests. We don't have all the KGB documents to see how many priests were recruited on all over the Soviet period, but some researchers think that about 10% of all Catholic Church leaders or priests were recruited. So it's not 1%, but 10% is not a very big number. But Catholic Church is very sensible to this. Even 10% for them is very, very big. So one example of KGB activity is KGB students. For agents from bishops and priests, KGB gave tasks to develop relationship with Vatican in Soviet useful manner and ways. to appoint useful bishops, priests, to spread useful for Soviet information, good situation of Catholic Church in Lithuania, negative about a resistant priest and emigrant priest. Also collect useful information about Vatican policy towards Soviet Union. Emigrant priests also lived and acted in Vatican, and KGB interested in their activity very much. It was a headache for them. One of the examples of KGB activity in the Vatican, KGB case student, that lasted from 1956 to 62. That was sanctioned by your Soviet Union KGB. This task was by covering up studies in Lithuanian St. Kazimierz Catholic School to infiltrate KGB agent into Vatican surrounding. This case that consists of 3 files. This case reflects plans, expectation of KGB and activity of agents in implementing KGB tasks. In letter to Soviet Union KGB, Lithuanian KGB speaks about possibility to send priest agents to Vatican to study and implement these tasks, to reveal targets of Lithuanian priest emigrants, plan of Vatican towards Lithuania, and their connection with Lithuania priests. To strengthen their relationship with useful persons in Vatican, put under agents to Western secret agents, to help them to get higher education in order they could get higher position in church in Lithuania. They also had to spread this information west, get blanks of documents that could be used for disinformation action in the West in the future. These tasks were implemented by KGB agents, the Sun and Pine Tree. Later, these 2 agents made a good career. KGB prepared to this action very carefully. Agents were investigated and prepared. They checked their loyalty, views, secret technique methods were put into their living places. Other agents were investigated them. For example, Agent Sun was recruited when he entered the seminary. Also, KGB trusted in this agent and his views, but still he was tested. His personality, habits. Maybe KGB had doubts that Western ways of life can sway loyalty. They also were obliged to collect intelligence information about anti-Soviet activity of Lithuanian immigrants, make contacts with Vatican important persons, spread information about situation of Catholic Church, control the relationship between immigrants, Vaticans, and Lithuanian priests. My remark, all these 3 files repeated and repeated this plan. So sometimes it's quite boring to read because so it shows that nothing changed in these 3 years, but they're still repeating and believing that they will manage to do something important. In their reports, a lot of reports of agents describe situation in a Catholic college, give interesting information about priests, their characteristic, sometimes very negative, other person who worked there, their relationship anti-Soviet action, and signs, maybe signs of sympathy to Soviets, so potential agents. Especially, they wanted to find facts of a moral life and a relationship with secret services. Any relationship with women were treated as intimate relationship. Strong, determined character was treated as careerism, action to get money for liberation of Lithuania as love for the money. These negative, also called negative features were treated and were estimated as potential future possibility to recruit, because they were looking for some way to get close to this person. For example, Agent Sun had to spread the information that Soviet government had no position in Lithuania. Most of Lithuania did not support those who resist. Resistance of priests made damage to church because other priests, bishops suffered, and church did not feel any pressure from government. These agents were watched during their studies, especially their letters with relatives in Lithuania. KGB did not like that Agent Pine Tree sent package to his housekeeper, his mistress, and KGB agents. She was recruited when this agent was sent to Vatican. So she was recruited to watch after him. Of course, they didn't know each other as an agent. KGB did not trust in this agent very much, so they sent a letter to resident in Italy, to talk to him about writing letters to relatives in Lithuania. In 1960s, a new plan for agent's son was prepared. Bishop Vincentas Latkevičius asked agent to transfer some information to Vatican, but KGB agent did not do it. And KGB said to do it like this. Agent Pinetree had to collect discredited information about local priests, teachers in seminary, immigrants. Agent Pinetree reported about meetings of Lithuanian immigrant priests in 1961, where they talked about anti-Soviet action and expressed concern about the situation of Catholic Church. This report shows that KGB tried to take control of communication with Vatican. In the Lithuanian KGB report to Soviet Union about results of this agent's activity, concern about the activity was expressed. But still, they recommended for the further sending them to study in Vatican. In 1962, plans for those agents were prepared again. KGB agent Pinetree had to try to make contacts with Western special agencies, collect compromise. How to connect to Western agencies? Lithuanian immigrants in USA, in West Germany, and probably in Vatican, Italy, had some contacts with secret services. So they believed that they can manage to make some contacts through immigration with secret services. Agent Son was asked to prepare an article in Eastern and Western Germany press against Vatican and spread into different countries with the help of other agents. To sum up, it can be said, although KGB succeeded in sending KGB agents to study to Vatican, but their plans were too optimistic. They got interesting information, but their activity did not make essential break in relationship with Vatican, did not succeed in total control of their relationship, and hardly who believed in the information about Lithuania, because reports of agents reflect that immigration did not trust in these people. They did not let them to come closer to speak, to give some information. So it means that they did not succeed at the main target, to get closer, to get some make connections. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have time to this discussion. If you want to ask a question, come on, let's go.
Thank you. Przemysław Pazik from Warsaw. I have a question to Hungarian colleagues about something Ms. Kiss mentioned at the end of her presentation. So the intellectual propensity to collaborate with, or to accept communism as an ideology, as a mean to understand the world by priests or faithful of, like in your case, Protestant denominations. To what extent these were like discourses or intellectual tools developed after 45, so in response to the communists being on the ground, and to what extent these were like minority trends even in the interwar period. For comparison, you mentioned, for instance, the visit of Karol Barth in Hungary in 48. There is a mirror move in Poland in 47. Emmanuel Mnie comes to Poland, and he makes contacts with progressive Catholics. But those progressive Catholics were also progressive Catholics during the interwar, and to what extent they were like progressive Lutherans, progressive Calvinists in the interwar, and so their conversion to communism would be like more genuine than opportunistic. This would be my question.
Thank you very much. It's a quite complex question, and probably I cannot give you a simple answer in 2 minutes. Just mention some elements. But I think we have to take into consideration that in 1945, the meaning that I sympathize with communism doesn't mean that I'm sympathize with Stalinism, and doesn't mean that I really know what communism is. There is a very deep, let's say, left-wing social Protestant tradition in Hungary, which of course had different connections towards different intellectual groups, and they had some sort of ideas what communism means. But it was their own idea, and when they met, the Stalinist leaders come back from Moscow, and they met the real modus operandi of the communist party, then they realized that they were probably naive. They had some kind of utopia or so on. So I think there was a large group of this sort of people with real strong, social sentiments and a kind of, how to say it in English, not capitalist, not socialist, but a kind of, third way, yeah, from Röpke, This is one part. And the other part, or other group like János Péter, who was a high intellectual person, speaking a lot of languages, and met the Marxism and communist ideology in the 1930s in Paris, in France, and met the met the Communist Party, and probably we don't know, but there are some Budapest humors that they became the Communist Party member in the 1930s. So they had a kind of westernized Marxist picture on the one hand, and on the other hand, they realized a kind of that this is the only way of survive, and this is the only way of making career. And they get a kind of naive support from left. Karl Barth, whom I mentioned in my presentation, I didn't have time to mention that he wrote then a second letter in 1950s, but it was not public. It was a private letter to Albert Berecki, where he condemned him, how he collaborated with the totalitarian communist regime. Unfortunately, this letter was read only by the Secret Service and by Albert Berecki himself, but not the Protestant community. So it's, I think, a very complex and very interesting question. I'm sure I couldn't give you the complete answer. I probably can help you. Thank you.
As well. Well, the Hungarian society met communism first in 1919. For a short period of time, communists took over power, and it was a very great shock to the whole Hungarian society, which means that between the two world wars, Hungarian people were very anti-communists. I know only of one Lutheran pastor who sympathized with that communist rule in 1919, and he was put out of the church. He was deprived of his pastorship. And after the Second World War, also in the Lutheran case, as Réka said, it is very hard to decide how to define someone as a collaborator, because it has to be observed on the level of the persons themselves, those who we consider as collaborators, because in many cases, in my opinion, but there is no thorough research that can prove it. In many cases, those who we consider as collaborators were not ideologically with the Marxism and Leninism, but they were rather opportunistic. Or in the case of Ivan Rök, for example, who I mentioned in my lecture, and was the inspector of the Hungarian Lutheran Church between 1948 and 52. He was not a communist. He belonged to the smallholders party, but he had a very strong fear from the communist terror and from the bloodshed he imagined if the church doesn't do what the communists want them to do. And therefore, he did everything to satisfy the communist will, and that was the thing that made him a collaborator. So the exact definition for a collaborator cannot be formulated. Just because every situation was different, but I think most of the pastors were not in front of the new regime, and only a very few who were put into high positions were ready to fulfill the communist will inside the church.
Thank you very much for these answers. I think this problem of collaboration should be discussed. Maybe we should organize another conference about this problem, as we discussed with Beata in the internal of this session. We have another question.
Thank you all for all your inspiring papers. We have a limited time, so I will have just one question for Kristina regarding the sources on which you based your paper. What kind of type of sources are those? Where are they kept, and are they accessible to every researcher who wants to study it? Thank you.
This topic is based on KGB documents. They are in Lithuanian Special Archive, former KGB archive. I think they are already acceptable to society because our institution, some workers have exceptional rights to get some documents with special era KGB agents. But I think people already can see this file too.
I have another question in addition to this problem. Can you identify all of these sources which you mentioned about? There is such a possibility, because I remember a few discussions in the Lithuania that there is some problem to giving a public information about secret collaboration in your country.
These two, Pine and Sen, they are identified. We know who they are. But with some of the others are problems, because when the illustration process was going on, some priest came to confess, and this information is forbidden. But not so much of agents come to confess, so... But with agents in Catholic Church, it's quite easy to identify. Working with this subject with Catholic Church, it's I know my colleague, former colleague, who researches the history of Catholic Church, so he knows a lot of who stands behind the name of this agent.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any other question, or come on? Marketa, you have a question? No? Okay. So if we don't have any questions, I can invite you to the lunch. Thank you very much for this very intensive papers, and we'll continue after 1 hour break.